try and find out if they know anything about him and if they care. Hello. We're from the BBC. We just wanted to speak to you about the statue there. Do you know anything about it? Have you heard of Lenin? No, not John Lennon. No. Yeah? Okay. You've heard of Lenin?
Yeah, of course I know. Everybody's heard of Lenin. What are you guys talking about? What have you not read? Russian Revolution? पागल होता है आप?
नहीं पढ़ा तो नहीं पढ़ा
What do you think of him?
I support his views to a certain extent. The good about him is that I love the fact that where he mobilized people against something that, was wrong, clearly wrong, but I feel his intention, his views were coming from a good place. The foundation of his belief was correct. And if it would have been perpetrated in the right manner, things would have changed for the better.
And what do you think of the left parties in India right now?
The left party here is very much misunderstood because I've seen anybody with left views automatically termed as anti-nationalist. So I feel the left view or the left ideology is not understood at all in this country.
I'm Kavita Krishnan, and I'm a member of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist. I was born in 1973, and I was born in Bhilai, which was the steel plant, steel township. This is in central India, so this is in the state which is now called Chhattisgarh. The steel plant is still there, but it was set up with Russian collaboration. So, in fact, there were a lot of Russians in the town where I was brought up. They would regularly come to live in Bhilai for quite a long while to sort of help with the plant. And so my parents learned Russian. They attended a Russian class. They learned Russian. We had children's books, which were of a wonderful quality, both literature as well as science. They would have these book camps. Then I still have many of those books even now at home.
I'm talking to Kavita at her offices in one of the back streets of bustling Delhi. The left have recently suffered electoral defeats in India, but this does not deter her belief that they will one day come back.
I became a communist in the early 1990s, immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union. I felt as though one has to be concerned about what was happening to India's workers, what was happening to India's women. We didn't think that Marxism and communism was only about the Soviet Union. The media propaganda declared that capitalism was entering India, globalization was entering India, the Indian youth only wanted jobs and they have no interest in socialism, communism is dead, capitalism has won, it's the end of history. That was what we were full of. I was among the young people who were attracted to the left precisely in that period.
But the current state of the left is a far cry from the huge popularity it enjoyed in the past. This stretches back to the birth of India itself in 1948.
600 miles away in Delhi, Independence Day was also a day of rejoicing. Tumultuous crowds filled the streets, celebrating, singing and laughing.
India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, speaking on one of his later trips to England.
I have come now in the last lap of a very long journey. For the last 5 weeks I have been travelling about various parts of Europe and Asia. And I'm glad.
Nehru had a strong socialist vision for this newly independent country.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much.
We've come to the beautiful courtyard home of a man who actually worked with Nehru as one of the first intakes of Indian diplomats in 1949. He was also Foreign Secretary from 1982 to 85, serving under Indira Gandhi.
You sit there and you sit there.
At 95 years old now, frail but immaculately dressed and looking striking with his full head of white hair, Maharaja Krishna Rasgotra still amazingly has the sharpest of memories of those times and of Nehru himself.
At that time, we were only about 90 persons in the Indian diplomatic service. I saw a great deal of him, the man of that nobility, sort of perception of the world, which I don't know how he gathered it, how he got it. He was educated, of course, in Cambridge. But his thinking was governed by old Indian thinking, traditional thinking, which lays great emphasis on the necessity of peace, looking at the entire world as a home, common home of all humanity. and he wanted to work for those ideals.
The Nehru government of India spearheaded a new movement during the Cold War, known as the policy of non-alignment. They brought together over 100 countries, former colonies and developing countries including Cuba, Iran and South Africa, which decided not to take sides, but rather push for their own autonomy while maintaining relations with both the Soviet Union and the USA, so as not to be dictated to by either of them.
He was a man for independence, you see. 12 years in British jails. Hmm? Then he became Prime Minister of this vast country, and the spirit of independence was also working on his mind. So why should I be bound to another country or group of countries' policies? India's ethos was essentially against violence and war. He was Gandhi's disciple, worked with him the best part of his life. He was Buddha's scholar. See, this was his mental makeup. It was a policy, not neutrality and not taking sides, in line with India's ethos.
Right.
And also India's present day interest, which was development.
In a choice between guns and butter, India during Nehru's time through the 50s and early 60s was firmly focused on butter as the country faced famine and huge poverty. Ah, my God. I'm ripping the cover from a newly published book by Zorawar Daulat Singh. So that's the book, Power and Diplomacy, India's Foreign Policies During the Cold War. Very recent, and you've got this really nice Indian checkered cloth on it.
Yes.
You want to talk
so,
about what
so
that
yeah,
means?
so that's actually quite interesting. It's really a metaphor for. This is an old ancient game of pachisi. It's called the Indian equivalent of chess, so to speak. So, the metaphor here is that the dominant image we think of these superpowers battling it out on the chessboard, and India was one of those pieces. But here it's India is sort of also in its own small way playing some sort of a game, and this book is really a story about how that game played out over a 20-25 year period that I look into.
Zorawar took a research interest in India's game playing during the Cold War and explains how the policy of non-alignment, that is, not taking sides, was no easy feat. In fact, it was a tricky interplay of diplomacy, carefully playing one superpower off against another to achieve the best outcome for themselves and their own club of countries.
India, after 200 years of colonial rule, has finally got its liberation, got its sovereignty, and it wasn't going to let the Cold War just subsume that completely, because the choice being given to India and many of its peers was you have to join us, that if you don't join us, you simply cannot survive.
Important archives were used in Zorawar's research.
So India has a rather archaic and disappointing process of declassifying historical documents. In fact, for the most part, they don't really do so. The reason why we do know much of what happened in the 1950s is because of the Jawaharlal Nehru papers, which are housed in the Teen Murti Museum and Library, which is one of the premier archival institutions in India.
He recommends we go and see the Nehru papers for ourselves to show the stance that Nehru took to stand up to pressure from the Soviet Union. Inside the Nehru library, amongst the musty old books and manuscripts, there are old letters of Jawaharlal Nehru, recently made available for the first time. They reveal some of the power dynamics that went on behind closed doors during the Cold War era. Take this top secret telegram I'm holding now, written in old typescript on yellowing paper. It's written from India's ambassador to Russia at that time. He's responding to a meeting the ambassador had with Stalin, where Stalin inquires about India's position in the world, to which Nehru states, Stalin's questions about India's independence show lack of understanding of a completely independent status in regard to everything: foreign, domestic, political, military, economic, and trade. We have no commitments of any kind which bind us. Nehru's determination to maintain India's independence through peace and coalition building made way for his successors' more forthright approach towards security, following his death in 1964. Indira Gandhi, Nehru's daughter, served 4 terms from 1966 until her assassination in 1984. Under her leadership, guns took priority over butter.
What happens is many of those balance of power ideas that had laid sort of dormant in the 50s surface quite strongly in the 1960s, and India is able to, or does, exercise a lot more strategic options. They deepens ties with Moscow, particularly to build up itself militarily, because many of the modern arms that were coming or being offered by the US bloc were coming with either strings attached, which were insulting to India's identity, or they weren't even on very good terms as well.
In 1971, there was a war between India and Pakistan, which led eventually to the creation of Bangladesh.
We can only say that we have been doing and we will continue to do everything possible to avoid an armed conflict.
India asked the US for help, but it was not forthcoming. The US were keen to keep Pakistan as a close ally.
We have to also look to our interests.
Krishna Rasgotra remembers the crisis India faced at that time as millions of refugees poured in from what was then East Pakistan. Russia stepped in to offer support to India, and it led to the signing of the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation.
When Pakistan, West Pakistan, was carrying out a genocide in East Bengal, the United States, ally of Pakistan, ignored the genocide. He was pressuring us. 10 million East Bengalis had come into India. I was in Washington at the time. I was told, you see, India traditionally has taken great migration, so what is 10 million people? You can take it. We'll help you financially. It's such a vulgar thing to say at that time when we were under such pressure. So what did we do? We forged a passing alliance with the Soviet Union.
And that must have angered the United States.
It came in Washington as a bombshell. I witnessed that total bafflement. What is it that has happened? And Nixon's reaction was, well, he used to call Nehru a secret communist, you see. These people, they are scoundrels anyway. They called India all kinds of names. Rascals, scoundrels, unreliable fellows in the White House. So, we sort of quietly, I must say, I enjoyed that situation.
That Indo-Soviet treaty leaves a legacy still today. This year, a deal was signed for Russia to open a Kalashnikov factory in India, and Russians are still supporting India's military infrastructure. Also this year, India has been hosting this event.
I declare the 5th edition of Army Scoutmasters competition open.
The Army Games are usually held in Russia, but this year, India have been hosts for part of the competition, which saw 6 other armies, including Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, come to India to compete in events such as
navigation and survival skills, the obstacle course. There is sniper competitions, mounting the helicopter to infiltrate behind the enemy lines. Hello Divya, I am Colonel Aman Anand. I am the spokesperson for Ministry of Defence, India.
Colonel Anand, what are these games, and which games or which skills do you think India is going to excel at?
I think this is the most competitive event I am going to witness between these countries in my professional career of 25 years. Yes, but we are the home team, so there would be...
We have an advantage being the home team? We have an advantage?
See, I'm not saying that we have an advantage, but I think generally speaking, any team who's playing at the home turf would understand the place a little better. So I think this is a general thing.
So this seems to be a really elaborate exercise.
Yes, very elaborate.
Why is it important for India to host a part of the event? What is there to gain in that sense? Is it a diplomatic move or is it a military move? Does it help the army or does it help the diplomacy?
There is a definite advantage because you learn good practices, you work in different terrains, you interact, engage with other armies of the world. It's like your heart and soul put into a competition. At the end of the day, you have sweat together. In cases you have bled together, and then you retire together into common activities. And there is a lot to gather from there. And we are engaging all major countries and neighbors in such military activities.
So, are there other events organized by other countries, say the United States, which we participate in and therefore get a chance to interact with their military and, see all of these skills and test them?
So, we participate in military activities, exercises, we call them, with America, with US, for all three services, Army, Navy, Air Force. We engage with them at different times. I will not be covering that right now.
So, who are the favorites to win these games?
I think you're asking a serving military officer of the Indian Army. Do I have to still answer the question?
Who's won in the past? Yeah.
So, Russia has always won this event in the past.
So far, we've been hearing about diplomatic links between India and the Soviet Union. What about the United States? Well, after 11 years of hardly any dialogue between the two countries, relations between them started warming up in the 1980s, 11 years after the 1971 war, according to Krishna Rasgotra.
With America, with the change of government, with change of Nixon, Henry Kissinger was very keen to find reconciliation with India. I, as Foreign Secretary, Reagan was the president there. He was inviting Indira Gandhi to pay a state visit to Washington. This was in 1982. Indira Gandhi was willing, I think, to do that, but the advisors around her, other than me, said you shouldn't go there, they'll insult you, they'll abuse you, this, that, or that. I told her, I was her foreign secretary, I used to meet her every day, more or less. I said, ma'am, I know America, they will adore you, you go there, times have changed. And this man, Reagan, wants to make up with India, and we should respond positively. She overruled her closest advisor, accepted the invitation, and staged a visit, which went off beautifully.
And US-Indian relations have continued to go from strength to strength. Another turning point followed the fall of communism in 1991, which coincided with an important date in Indian history, the start of market liberalization. In a rain break from the scorching heat of Delhi, we take a tiny lift up to the fourth floor of these newspaper offices to meet an experienced commentator of India's current foreign affairs policies.
Hi, I'm Suhasini Haider. I'm the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, as well as its national editor. I look at its national editions, and I worked in television before this for about 25 years, but I focused mainly on Indian foreign policy, particularly in the subcontinent. In the recent past, the non-aligned movement has become more or less, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union, non-alignment essentially became synonymous with anti-Americanism. That was never the original idea.
But wasn't the non-aligned movement about not taking sides?
Well, let's put it this way. Sometimes history turns out differently from the way it is envisioned. And certainly, I think if you look at most of the non-aligned movement members at the forefront, these were essentially countries that did eventually come closer to the Soviet bloc. Now, the truth is that non-alignment as an idea lost a lot of its glimmer in the early 1990s, and that was because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And more people were saying there is a new sheriff in town, and that's the United States. India is reforming its economy. It needs to go much further with the US than it has ever gone before. And Indian foreign policy changed.
And India's economic policy changed as well. So we had a whole round of liberalization and we opened up the economy. Did that bring us closer to the United States? What warmed the two countries up?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the truth is, what did the collapse of the Soviet Union show us? It showed us The Soviet model of economy was not going to be seen as a success story. We hit our first big crisis with the gold reserves having to be sold, and so India internally began to see that its economy could just be a reason for it to fall apart, and the sudden realization that India would not grow without energy.
In today's new world order, the US sees India as a stabilizing force in the region, but currently there are a number of sticking points, including on trade tariffs and India's oil imports from Iran.
The United States, for example, has told India, don't buy Iranian oil, don't allow the Chinese telecom major Huawei into your country for the 5G network, don't buy S-400 from Russia. You have Russia making it very clear that if you cancel your defense deals with Russia because of pressure from the US, they will also have issues with that. In the recent past, we've seen Russia actually cozying up to Pakistan for different deals. So you're seeing this happen again and again, that on various issues, nobody is saying, take this from me and take that from the other. They're saying, you're going to have to come to the buffet on this side or the buffet on that side.
So India once again finds itself trying to negotiate between the US and Russia, whilst trying to fight for its own interests. Kavita Krishnan from India's left wing sees this as a major problem facing her country.
India is a huge potential market, all right? Let's be very clear that what does a Trump see when they look at India? They look at India with the bib and fork on as a market for their companies. They are not looking at India as an emerging political power. So they say nice things, of course, about India deserving a place at the UN or, UN Security Council and this and that. But that's very different from what the reality is.
Therefore, for India to be taken seriously on the global stage and to show real influence and power, Suhasini Haider believes that India will have to once again show leadership as Nehru did during the Cold War and form new alliances to navigate current power dynamics if it wants to achieve the best outcomes for India and fight the wars of the future.
Is India going to have to choose one over the other? Or is India actually going to have to reinvent some version of the non-aligned movement to build a coalition of like-minded countries like Germany or Japan or Korea? Say, hey, I don't want to have to choose. And I don't like the idea of a world where everybody is going to have to go into blocks once again, as they did during the Cold War, and choose their sides.
That would be very ironical.
Well, it certainly would be, but the fact is that India today is once again in that position because it's the US on one side and Russia and China on the other are essentially beginning to square up for another fight for the next century. The fights are over technological issues. You have a situation with data, for example. These are all fights for the future. Artificial intelligence once again, cyber warfare. You are going to see a whole series of new age areas of contestation. In a situation like that, India is really going to have to look once again and see where its interests lie.
India's Cold War legacy was presented by me, Divya Arya, and the producer was Nina Robinson. The next program in the Cold War Legacy series will be coming from Angola, where Andrew Harding will be visiting Africa's largest battlefield during the Cold War.
This is the BBC World Service.
Life changes.
A few months ago, I was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, to give it its full name.
This is the superpower. I view it as a gift.
I'm Saida Hashemi, and I'm going to meet others with the condition and find out if there is a more positive way of viewing ADHD.
ADHD and Me, Tuesday at 8:30 and 15:30 GMT. And in 30 minutes, the Cultural Frontline. He's the artist who's dedicated himself to the understanding and exploration of sound. We hear from Nick Ryan on the soundscapes of our world, and he tells us why he wants us all to share what we hear during lockdown. On air, online, on smartphone, and on smart speaker. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
On
from our own correspondent after this bulletin, New Orleans in lockdown, when the heartland of jazz and Mardi Gras comes to a standstill.
A lockdown, or a shelter-in-place order as we call it in the United States, is particularly painful in a place where solitude belongs only to the writers, the visual artists, and the less fortunate elderly.
At a time of coming together in Jerusalem, told to stay home.
As he sees it, this Passover each household ate alone, much as the scriptures say Jewish families did before their exodus from slavery in Egypt, the event marked by the holiday.
And a visit to a voodoo festival in Haiti.
Each morning, we woke at dawn for prayers, and in the afternoons we gathered in an earth-floored temple decorated with a glittering chandelier and red and blue ribbons.
All that and more on From Our Own Correspondent after this bulletin of BBC World News.
Hello, this is Julie Candler with the BBC News. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said he would have died from COVID-19 if it hadn't been for the care he received at the London hospital from which he was discharged today. In a message of thanks to the doctors and nurses who treated him, Mr Johnson said it could have gone either way. The number of coronavirus deaths in UK hospitals has now risen above 10,000. Mr Johnson, who spent 3 days in intensive care after his admission last Sunday, said he owed a huge debt to the National Health Service.
We will win because our NHS is the beating heart of this country. It is the best of this country. It is unconquerable. It is powered by love.
A leading scientist advising the British government on the pandemic has warned that it's not yet known whether people who test positive for the virus become permanently immune. Speaking to the BBC, Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust highlighted how in South Korea dozens of people had tested positive for the illness a second time.
I think there's been almost 100 reports now of people that have been infected, they seem to have recovered, and then at a later date they became infected again. It is critical to understand whether those are one viral infection that has persisted in one individual for a considerable time and now has reactivated, or whether they've been infected with a second virus.
Italy has recorded its lowest daily number of coronavirus deaths in more than 3 weeks, 431. Officials say the crisis there has peaked. Italy has suffered more fatalities than any other European nation and seems certain to join the United States above the 20,000 mark tomorrow. Spain registered another 619 deaths, bucking a previous downward trend. From Madrid, here's Guy Hedgecoe.
There are some statistical reasons that might be somehow distorting these figures at the moment, and that's possible because of the Easter holiday, and it might be delaying how local authorities are reporting their figures. So I think there's always been a suspicion that the figures over this Easter holiday might not be entirely reliable.
New York has seen its lowest daily increase in the number of hospital patients since the authorities started tracking the data nearly 4 weeks ago. Andrew Cuomo, the state's governor, called it good news, but he said for a 6th consecutive day more than 700 people had died. The top infectious disease doctor in the US has said that reopening the country will need to be a very gradual process, and restrictions could only be lifted soon in certain areas. Dr. Anthony Fauci said that inevitably there will be further infections as restrictions are loosened. But if it's done slowly, there'll be time to identify cases and isolate them. World news from the BBC. A French aircraft carrier on which 50 sailors have tested positive for COVID-19 has arrived in the port of Toulon in the south of France. 3 crew members had already been flown to a military hospital there as a precaution. The crews of both the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier and the frigate accompanying it will be tested and placed under quarantine for 2 weeks. Pope Francis has delivered his Easter address from behind closed doors at a deserted St. Peter's Basilica, calling for global solidarity in the face of the coronavirus pandemic. He said everyone was suffering and governments needed to act together to deal with the economic fallout. Our religion editor Martin Bashir has this report.
In Rome, Pope Francis delivered his annual message in starkly different circumstances to those normally associated with the joy of Easter Sunday. No flowers around the basilica, no pilgrims in St. Peter's Square, and he referred to the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War as a way to honour the faith and fight back against the coronavirus.
Air France has been forced to postpone a flight from the Republic of Congo after a security official shot and damaged the plane. The incident happened at the airport in Pointe-Noire, the country's second largest city. No passengers were on board the plane when it was shot at. It was supposed to be repatriating French citizens because of the coronavirus outbreak. In other news, the Taliban say they've released 20 prisoners they describe as members of the Afghan government. The militants have published photographs of the men, who they say are Afghan soldiers, detained in Kandahar several years ago. There's been no confirmation of the release from the Afghan authorities, nor has Kabul identified the men. BBC News.
This is from our own correspondent on the BBC World Service. I'm Pascal Harter. Hello and welcome to the programme. This month it's Passover, Easter and Ramadan. But in the holy city of Jerusalem, Jews, Christians and Muslims can't observe their traditions with friends and family this year. We speak to the leaders of all three faiths about how they're looking after their communities. In Hungary, we ask, is democracy a casualty of the coronavirus quarantine? And in Haiti, we visit a voodoo ceremony. But first, the US state of Louisiana has known plenty of bad times. Hurricane Katrina swept people's homes away in 2005 and caused billions of dollars of damage. But in spite of the adversity its residents have faced, locals still like to let the good times roll. And this is why so many tourists like to visit too. Mardi Gras, with its parades and parties, is the culmination of a month of celebrations in New Orleans. But early in March, Louisiana recorded its first case of the coronavirus. It's now what's known as a coronavirus hot zone. The bars are closed, the clubs are silent. Harry Shearer, acclaimed radio host and a well-known voice from the cartoon show The Simpsons, is afraid for the future of his city, although he also recognises that it has been here before.
Carnival in New Orleans begins in earnest with 2 parades on a Saturday night. This year, I was the king of one of them, wearing a regally embroidered bathrobe on a carriage that, unlike the one I rode as the parade's first king a decade ago, actually completed the entire route. It was early February, mild weather. The streets were full of people celebrating their first real chance this year to celebrate. A month later, the city's mayor declared a state of emergency. The novel coronavirus had come to town. The laissez-le-bon-temps roulé culture of New Orleans is built on 3 centuries of disasters, big and small. A recent article by the prestigious cultural geographer Richard Campanella reminds us of the recurrent outbreaks of yellow fever and, yes, malaria that challenged the city through its first 200 years. The last yellow fever outbreak in the Crescent City, so named for its geographical embrace of the meandering Mississippi, occurred only a little more than 100 years ago. So, New Orleans celebrates every day, every moment, in the shadow of the knowledge that our good fortune is quite temporary. The flip side of that knowledge is a desire and an ability to rebuild after each challenge. After the 2005 flood, that rebuilding was an arduous battle against widespread predictions of the city's impending demise. Those maledictions included a comment from the then Speaker of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., Dennis Hastert, that the city should be given up as a lost cause. Well, the city is still here. There are echoes of this history, as New Orleans has been branded one of the pandemic's hotspots. The city's culture is based in the streets. Funerals, parades, semi-spontaneous parties, brass bands. It is a culture of gatherings and minglings, of which Mardi Gras is only the biggest, the one we share with outsiders. A lockdown, or a shelter-in-place order as we call it in the United States, is particularly painful in a place where solitude belongs only to the writers, the visual artists, and the less fortunate elderly. New Orleans has a hurricane season, June through November. Not to jinx anything, but contrary to the dire predictions Katrina spawned, Most of America's hurricanes have been heading up the country's east, not its Gulf Coast. Given those facts, New Orleanians often hold hurricane parties as the storms near. Now, friends have been telling me of the kids, the damn kids, holding COVID parties in the neighborhood. Last week, the deadly virus took a local jazz patriarch, Ellis Marsalis, the paterfamilias of the Marsalis clan. Not only was he a pillar of the city's storied tradition of piano players, not only was he the father of Wynton Marsalis, who's gone on to lead jazz at New York's Lincoln Center, but Ellis was revered for decades as one of the city's prime educators of young musical talent. This has been a particularly difficult few years for the music community, which bade farewell to R&B giants like Alan Toussaint, singer, pianist Dr. John, and less world-famous but equally potent pianist Henry Butler. It's been decades since New Orleans music had a prominent place in America's pop framework, back to 60s hits like Working in a Coal Mine and Mother-in-Law, but music remains one of the city's major lures for tourists, along with cups of rum drinks you can take into the streets with you. We call them Go Cups. The city's leaders are wondering about the community's future as a tourist magnet, much as they did post-Katrina. Perhaps perplexingly, while the state governor says local hospitals need more ventilators, the governing board of the convention center, itself now a makeshift hospital, is preparing to vote on a $1 billion plan for a new hotel and entertainment district. And in another echo of the post-Katrina moment, there has been a certain amount of victim blaming. Some observers from outside are saying the city became a virus hotspot because of the authorities' failure to cancel Mardi Gras. In fact, Fat Tuesday occurred 3 weeks before President Trump declared a national emergency. The city cherishes its otherness, its cultural difference from the rest of the country, and the city pays for it. We worry about the future of that culture. Can the music venues survive? Can the restaurants? Many of the eateries have set up takeaway services trying to stay open, keep their staffs employed. But only my best-off friends are able to keep ordering. Others wonder about the safety of eating food prepared by other people's hands. The quiet is reminiscent too. 15 years ago, there was no traffic. There were no children, no dogs. In some neighborhoods, neighbors on adjoining front porches are collaborating in spontaneous jazz performances. But for the most part, the music of New Orleans now, as in 2006, is mainly the melodic whistles of the freight trains that still roll through, and the whistles of the freighters still plying the Mississippi.
Harry Shearer. It's Easter this weekend. It's also the Jewish holiday of Passover, and the Islamic holy month of Ramadan will soon get underway. In Jerusalem, a city holy to all three faiths, these holidays would usually be observed and celebrated by a coming together of friends and family. But this year, of course, is very different. Jerusalem is in lockdown. Working from her home, our Middle East correspondent Yolan Nell has been asking local religious leaders how they will be observing the holidays.
Usually at this time, there's a crush of foreign visitors and locals heading through the gates in the ancient crenellated walls of Jerusalem's old city. But now they stand eerily quiet. And in recent days, workers wearing masks and those now familiar white hazmat suits have been spraying disinfectant around the holy places, on the revered stones of the Western Wall and wooden doors leading to Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy Sepulchre Church. At Easter, we like to go almost every day to Jerusalem to participate in the celebrations, laments Father Jamal Khadr, a Catholic priest in Ramallah. This year, we miss that a lot. He's speaking to me on Skype inside his own empty parish church in the West Bank. On Palm Sunday, there was no magnificent spectacle of thousands of Christians marching from the Mount of Olives carrying their palm fronds. With a ban on mass gatherings, Easter services inside the Holy Sepulchre, built where many believe Jesus was crucified, entombed and resurrected, are taking place in front of cameras only. Families are encouraged to watch at home on TV or online and simply pray together. This year will be unique, but we have to do it for the safety of everyone and to live the spirit of Easter, says Father Jamal. During these strange circumstances, which have me interviewing religious leaders in my slippers at home on my laptop, I ask Father Jamal how he comforts his worried parishioners. With a smile, he replies that the Easter message has a special resonance right now. The resurrection of Christ is the basis of our faith and at the same time our hope in a better future, he tells me. It's a message of hope that the darkness will not last. Unable to film Rabbi Yehoshua Pfeffer in person in Jerusalem, the oldest of his 8 children step in to help with a smartphone, and they take shots of each other, cleaning to get rid of the chametz, traces of leavened food prohibited during Passover. I hate this, says one girl, grimacing as she checks down the back of the sofa. On the night of the traditional Seder meal, Israel's government banned travel between cities and told people in Jewish-majority areas not to leave their homes. The fear was that customary celebrations with relatives and friends could spread COVID-19. It's really tough, says Rabbi Pfeffer, who missed his parents. But among the foremost obligations of Torah law is to keep others safe. As he sees it, this Passover each household ate alone, much as the scriptures say Jewish families did before their exodus from slavery in Egypt, the event marked by the holiday. And Rabbi Pfeffer believes confinement encourages self-reflection. It's an opportunity to deepen our faith, he suggests, to deepen our relationships with those around us. When I link up with Dr. Mustafa Abu Sway, an Islamic scholar, his wife becomes my camera woman. With a few tips, she films our setup shot and close-ups. I'm finding remotely interviewing people in this way leads to a surprising intimacy. Dr. Mustafa's favourite Ramadan memories involve his family, the smell after his father put orange peel on the stove when he was a boy as they ate before starting the dawn to dusk fast, and praying at Al-Aqsa Mosque with his parents and children. Tight restrictions to stop infection, which have seen the famous mosque closed like other places of worship, are expected to stay in place during the coming holy month. We'll miss the large get-togethers, Dr. Mustafa remarks, but it's going to be back to basics, and it might also be a reminder for all of us that what we take for granted is not always going to be there. In the contested holy city of Jerusalem, religion often divides rather than unites. So when I ask these faith leaders about their messages for the holidays, I'm struck by their replies. I can see there's a certain willingness to put conflict on hold and collaborate during these difficult times, and I'd say, why not, says Dr. Mustafa. Why not basically change our worldviews? These days showed us clearly that we're one big human family, comments Father Jamal. It's time to realise we're in the same boat, observes Rabbi Pfeffer. How much our similarities outweigh and overshadow our differences, and to come together in faith, prayer, and dependence on God. During this frightening pandemic, there's solace in such expressions of goodwill, and many here will hope for lasting change when the crowds return once more to Jerusalem's sacred sites.
That was Yolande Nell. I'm Pascal Harter, and this is from our own correspondent on the BBC World Service. Several governments have given themselves far-reaching executive powers in the name of curbing the spread of the coronavirus, but Hungary has gone further than most. While Germany introduced testing, Singapore tightened surveillance and forced quarantine orders, Hungary's parliament has given the Prime Minister Viktor Orban the power to rule by decree indefinitely. The question is, why did Parliament go for it? Because it is dominated by Mr. Orban's own party, says Nick Thorpe in Budapest, and opposition parties had to choose between this or being portrayed as enemies of the nation.
This is a chicken game, Zoltán Kiseli explained as we strolled through a quiet city park near his home in Budapest's 9th district just before the lockdown came into effect. The air hummed with the first birds and the last children of spring. Soon the children were hustled indoors by anxious parents. Zoltán teaches political science at a Budapest university and is a devout supporter of the government, so he knows a lot about the chicken game. In its simplest form, 2 drivers steer directly at each other, and the first to lose his nerve and swerve is a chicken, a coward. All opposition parties in Hungary supported the idea of extending the state of emergency, which the government declared on March the 11th, when Hungary still had very few infections. But by making the law valid ad infinitum, whenever the Prime Minister decides the emergency is over, and by introducing a punitive clause allowing for journalists to be jailed for publishing misleading or false information about the emergency, the government left the opposition little choice but to oppose it. Accusations of courage and cowardice flew to and fro in Parliament as well. Viktor Orban doesn't usually lose his temper, but he came very close when he bellowed across the floor at the opposition benches that his 133 brave deputies alone stood for the national interest. Then I watched him, almost spitting fire, as Peter Jakob, leader of the opposition Jobbik party, steered his own patriotic bus straight at him. The real cowards, Mr. Jakob told him, are those who use the emergency to seize unlimited power, while the doctors and nurses of this country are fighting a life and death battle with the virus. While the politicians exchanged unfriendly fire, I visited the university hospital in Debrecen in eastern Hungary to see the preparations for the coronavirus patients. The current patients have been emptied from the infectious diseases ward and the workmen have moved in, laying pipes and installing new doors, monitors and beds. The trick, Dr. Istvan Barkonyi told me, is to create negative air pressure in each ward. So when a doctor or nurse comes in to visit a patient with the virus, the air from the corridor sweeps into the room and out through the window. What has happened in traditional hospitals where patients have been taken is that when the door opens, the infection spreads from the ward, straight out into the corridors and through the ventilation system, infecting other patients and medical staff. At one poorly equipped and ill-prepared hospital at Suceava in northeast Romania, no less than 182 doctors and nurses caught the virus, and 30 patients died. On the streets of Hungary, people have shown more common sense, kindness to strangers, and solidarity than many thought they were capable of. In the village where I write these lines, people who haven't spoken to each other in years discuss the state of the world, at a safe distance, of course. Though there are exceptions. My Chinese friend Zangi was filming a cooking program in the main covered market in Budapest in early March, when no less than 4 separate butchers, you know, the ones with shaved heads, he told me, swore and cursed his crew all the way back to China. Prime Minister Viktor Orban, like Donald Trump in America, devoted many of his early comments to finding ways to link coronavirus to illegal migration. Iranian students in Hungary were indeed among the early transmitters, but far from being here illegally, they were actually on a generous medical scholarship created by the Orban government. It has since turned out that some of the first cases of infection were Hungarians skiing in northern Italy and Austria, including the rector of the university hospital in Szeged, who went straight back to work, ignoring the recommended quarantine. Independent journalists in Hungary remain, so far at least, undaunted by either the threat of prosecution or the hate campaign against them in some pro-government papers. We're not panicking, András Földes told me in the empty offices of Index, the top online news portal. His colleagues had not gone underground, they were working happily from home. We try to work as if we were in an independent and free country. This is our only choice, András explained.
Nick Thorpe. Lastly, to an Easter festival with a difference. Souvenance is a week-long gathering that takes place each year on a dusty plain outside the city of Gonaïves in Haiti. It's one of the holiest pilgrimage for believers of voodoo. After Haiti declared independence from France in 1804, the voodoo faith flourished and became a symbol of liberty for the nation. It remains the dominant religion there. Thomas Rees remembers well attending the festival.
6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. The light scattered softly through the branches of the mapu trees, warm on our faces and our aching limbs. I was half asleep. We all were. The worshippers in their crisp white dresses and headscarves sat on the sprawling roots. The conch shell sounded, then the murmur of the shaker and the pad of bare feet on bare earth. Numinous light, 100 voices singing in unison. In my time travelling in Haiti, I attended many voodoo ceremonies, but none were quite like Souvenance. This voodoo community, or Lakou, is one of the largest and most important in Haiti. Each year, voodoo initiates known as Hunsis and hundreds of visitors travel from across the country and beyond to take part in rituals dedicated to the Daomei spirits. Each morning, we woke at dawn for prayers, and in the afternoons we gathered in an earth-floored temple decorated with a glittering chandelier and red and blue ribbons. A team of drummers hammered out galloping rhythms, passing around bottles of rum and planting cigarettes between each other's lips as the Hoonsies danced and sang late into the night. When they all changed into their brightly coloured costumes, floral dresses and paisley shirts, patterned head wraps and sashes embroidered with gold, the temple looked like one rippling swathe of fabric, a human magic eye. Real voodoo bears little resemblance to the twisted stereotype conjured up by Haiti's colonizers, missionaries and Hollywood film directors. People do get possessed. You see the Hoonsies' eyes roll back until their pupils vanish. They stagger and flail and shriek and giggle uncontrollably. They fall at the feet of the serviteur, the spiritual leader of the Laku, and leap into a sacred pool. There are sacrifices too. Goats with deep neck wounds are carried into the temple on dancers' shoulders, staining their white headscarves crimson. A bull is dispatched as a gift to Ogu Ferai, the warrior spirit,